Pantages, Chapter 7, Trial of the Century, Part 2. 1930 saw the onslaught of the Great Depression. Klondike Kate was one of the few who went to see Pantages while he was in jail. She took him the things he wanted: tobacco, fruit, and a few dollars. She said, "For I had no bitterness. That's one thing I know nothing of, revenge or bitterness." The largest of the Pantages theaters, the crown jewel of his empire, the grandiose Art Deco Hollywood Pantages, was built at a cost of $1.25 million and opened on June 4th. It seated 2,800 people. The choice of location of the theaters rested mainly on Pantages' sense of how to draw the largest audiences. It was home to the Academy Awards during the 1950s. Rodney Pages managed the Hollywood Pantages Theater until the Pantages family sold it in 1949 to RKO Theaters. That sale marked the first time since the turn of the century that the Pantages family did not own a theater in Los Angeles. Since then, Pantages has been president of Shasta Pan Oil Company, where he owned and operated a number of wells in the Torrance-Carson area. On the evening of the opening of his grandest creation, the Pantages Hollywood Theater, Pantages was lying in a Los Angeles County Jail hospital bed, suffering from chest pains. It was June 4th, 1930, and starry Hollywood turned out for this epic event, despite the nation plunging into economic meltdown. It was broadcast not on one, but two local radio stations. Pantages' lawyer had asked the LA District Attorney's Office to allow his client to visit the glittery event, but the assistant DA refused, claiming it was not his jurisdiction. That was an evasion, since 2 days later Pantages was suddenly given his freedom. Likely the reason he was refused participation in the grand celebration of his theater, broadcast on two radio stations, was because he had been convicted of sexually assaulting a 17-year-old dancer. Rumor has it that a ghost haunts the Pantages. Joe Kennedy had plenty to smile about. He had seen the Depression coming, and as Black Tuesday approached, Joe liquidated his longer-term investments while continuing to make money on the declining market. By selling short, Joe made sums estimated at more than $1 million and contributed to the eventual market crash by forcing prices down. The fact that the market was unregulated was largely responsible for the crash. Salesmen had made wild claims to a gullible public. Stock pools, such as those perfected by Joe Kennedy, had defrauded legitimate investors. Reporters and columnists had acted as shills for companies peddling stocks in returns for payoffs. The crash set off a worldwide financial panic and depression that would last for years. On June 4th, 1930, Pantages was listening to a radio broadcast of the theater's opening night festivities from his hospital cot in the county jail. He was also facing charges of contributing to the delinquency of minors over an affair in a San Diego hotel, the Love Mart case. Further, his wife Lois was keeping a low profile after being convicted of manslaughter in the drunk driving death of Joe Rocumato on Sunset and North Serrano. And thanks to the stock market crash, not only had his new Hollywood theater shrunk from 12 stories to 2, but it would be the last in his theater empire. In fact, by the future landmark's opening night, Pantages had dissolved his theater chain, trading nearly all of his theaters for stock in RKO and Warner Brothers. As for the Hollywood Pantages, it opened under the management of Alexander's sons, Lloyd and Rodney, and Fox West Coast Theaters. And Fox would wind up buying the Hollywood Pantages soon enough. On that opening night, at Spring's End in 1930, the auditorium held 3,000. The stage, behind a $6,000 drop curtain, measured 70 feet deep and 140 feet wide. Upstairs, the projection room was of a special interest. It is equipped for any future developments in the motion picture industry, including television. Eddie Cantor emceed that first night. Lloyd Pantages gave a little speech of thanks. Fanchon and Marco presented a review, Rose Garden Idea, and Slim Martin and his jazz band performed a few tunes. On the screen were a Mickey Mouse short, The Cactus Kid, and Marion Davies in The Florodora Girl. On September 26th, the appellate court granted the appeal of Alexander Pantages, theatrical producer, from his conviction and prison sentence for assaulting Eunice Pringle, 17-year-old dancer, ordering a new trial. Mr. Pantages, who was sentenced from 1 to 50 years in prison, has been at liberty under $100,000 bail. The court's decision was made upon Mr. Pantages' appeal from the Superior Court's refusal to grant a new trial, the higher court reversing the lower court's findings. The first reason, assigned for ordering a new trial, was the appellate court's finding of a prejudicial error on the part of D.A. Fitz and his deputy James Costello. Second cause was set forth as error by the trial court in refusing to allow defense counsel to examine a prosecution witness as to whether a criminal charge had been brought against the witness in Texas. On October 17th, the fight for the affirmation of the Alexander Pantages theater magnate was carried by the state of the California Supreme Court. The state argued, unsuccessfully, the appellate court's ruling, if permitted to stand, will reverse all known procedure in assault cases and will be a hardship on the women of the state. 2 years after his first trial, in 1931, Pantages got his retrial and was eventually acquitted. After filing a brief on statutory rape that ran 1,200 pages with the California State Supreme Court, which ruled for a new trial that began on the 3rd of November 1931. The defense team led by attorney Jerry Geisler wasted little time in the new proceedings to showcase the improbabilities in Pringle's original testimony. Chief among them was the improbability that the athletic, acrobatic Pringle, who weighed between 112 and 115 pounds and stood at 5'3", could not have overpowered the 5'6", 125-pound old Pantages. Geisler called him a scrawny little man. Pringle claimed in her original testimony that she was kicking during the entire assault, yet no marks or scratches were found on Pantages. Further, she had stated Pantages had his left hand over her mouth, and with his right hand was able to complete the assault, yet she did not repel him with her free hands in any way. If Pantages' motive was to attack her, Geisler asked, why did he not do so on the many previous occasions when she came to see him about her act? Finally, unlike in the first trial, Geisler was able to discuss in court Pringle's relationship with the 40-year-old Nicholas Dunaev, and he raised probing questions as to the probity of their relationship. The manager of the Moonbeam Glen Bungalow Court in Hollywood testified that Pringle and Dunaev not only shared apartment number 45 together, but may have lived as a man and wife, although they were not married. The second trial's jury found Pantages innocent on November 27, 1931. At the new trial, Pantages' lawyers reenacted the alleged rape and showed that it could not have occurred in the small broom closet the way Pringle had described it in the first trial. The jury was also shown how athletic Pringle was, casting doubt on her claim that she could not fight off advances by the slightly built Pantages. He always maintained that Pringle framed him. Numerous books and investigators have suggested that Pringle received bribe money from Joseph Kennedy in an attempt to smear the businessman and compromise him to the point of acquiring his theaters at rock-bottom prices. It is almost certain that Pringle was after money. The fact that the notorious meeting with him came only days after Pantages was on front pages everywhere after gaining astronomical millions from the sale of his theaters. There was never evidence that Kennedy was involved, but the absence of evidence against Kennedy is not proof that he may not have taken advantage of the scandal, especially since the Los Angeles Examiner, owned by his friend William Randolph Hearst, was the forerunner of attacks against Pantages. On May 28, 1931, Pantages' defense acts to bar women jurors. Currently seated are 8 men and 4 women, already going Pantages' defense on advantage to get a male liberal jury. The rumor began at the second trial that RKO and Kennedy paid Eunice Pringle to frame Alexander Pantages. At the new trial, Pantages' lawyers reenacted the alleged rape and showed that it could not have occurred in the small broom closet the way Pringle had described it. The jury was also shown how athletic Pringle was, casting doubt on her claim that she could not fight off advances by the slightly built Pantages. A bald, unpossessing man that looks like Alfred Hitchcock's half-brother, Jerry Geisler's tactic was to make Pringle seem more rapacious than Pantages. He first established Pringle was strong and athletic and could probably have pinned the scrawny old theater owner to the floor if she had wished to. She had arrived in court in pigtails and a little girl's dress, so Geisler asked the judge to make her wear the clothes she had worn the day of the rape. After she showed up in a low-cut crimson gown, Pantages was acquitted. Geisler established a precedent that character evidence could be used against an accuser of a minor age. Geisler pointed out her hands were free. He insisted it was impossible for an old man weighing only 125 pounds to have forcibly raped an athletic girl of 17, strong enough to do a full split and backflips. This, he claimed, was especially so if, as she claimed, one of his hands had been employed solely in keeping her from screaming for help. The high point of the trial came when Pantages took the stand in his own defense. She walked in and took off her coat and hat and laid them on a chair, he told the court. He carried on with a consistent conversation with his hands and body as he talked. I said, "Come on now, tell me your business. I don't want to hear any more about your act either." Then she grabbed me by the necktie with the left hand. We both raised up. She shoved the door shut with her right hand. Pantages got to his feet to give a demonstration. Then she pulled my shirt so. He jerks the shirt from under his belt to show the jury. She gave me a terrific kick, he went on, his voice growing more excited. She started to scream. I was trying to get her out the door, but she slipped down with her arms around my legs. He testified that he had been confused and was not completely sure what had happened. But finally I got her out the door. "Were your clothes torn when you left the room?" the lawyer asked. "I didn't lose a button," the theater man replied. On November 27th, the verdict was overturned on appeal in what a newspaper called the most tumultuous scene ever witnessed in a courtroom. Wild yells and cheers came from the spectators, who were keyed up by Geisler's brilliant, slashing attack that closed the case. They were cleared from the room, and Pantages rose gravely to shake the hand of the lawyer who had freed him from the threat of 50 years in prison. Miss Pringle made a bitter statement to the press. She said she had received hundreds of letters protesting the outrage. "It seems that anyone who asks for justice is doomed to failure. This verdict shows the value 12 Californians put on a girl's honor. You know they say, 'In God we trust,' but it is written on a dollar," Pringle said. The second jury acquitted Pantages on the basis that it was prejudicial to Pantages to exclude testimony about the morals of the plaintiff. The court found her testimony so improbable as to challenge credulity. But because of the notoriety, his business had plummeted. A few months after Kennedy's final offer of $8 million, Pantages was forced to sell out to Joe's RKO for $3.5 million. Pantages was finally found not guilty and acquitted of the charge of rape, but by then the country was in the midst of the Great Depression and had more important issues with which to contend. While the verdict was overturned on appeal, the trials were extremely costly. Pantages had to pay legal and medical bills amounting to $250,000. The legal battle and the trials, however, ruined him financially and exhausted a large part of his personal fortune, and probably contributed to heart failure that eventually claimed his life. Shortly thereafter, Pantages sold off his theater chain to RKO for a lower sum than originally offered, far less than what his Pantages Greek vaudeville palaces had cost him to build, and retreated into retirement where he owned and raced horses. He took to horse racing at Santa Anita and lived the life of a carefree former businessman, despite the fact that the bonds and shares he received for his operations were effectively worthless. Pantages spoke to the press of plans to start another theatrical empire in the early 1930s, but nothing came of them. Despite being exonerated in his second trial, his reputation was beyond repair, and in time he came to accept that his career had vanished when his theaters were sold. In 1931, at a simple ceremony attended only by relatives and close friends, his son Rodney Alexander Pantages married Beatrice Verrill Sweeney. According to current Los Angeles real estate lore, the father contracted with Williams to design and build a home for the couple as a wedding gift. The Los Feliz Hills Architectural Committee approved the plans for a palatial home behind a private gate for Rodney Pantages. The 5,000-plus square foot two-story wood, plaster, and brick fireplace, colonial Norman revival-style home was sited on a half-acre. The plans for the 12-room house included a landscaped pool with an elaborate outdoor seating area and separate guest house. The original Williams-styled interior included the architectural trim, sun-filled rooms, and the classic Williams curving staircase. Joe Kennedy plundered Pathé Exchange. He arranged for RKO to pay Pathé insiders, like himself, $80 a share. The rest of the stockholders would receive just $1.50 a share. Favoring insiders to such a degree was nothing more than robbery. Since Joe had acquired the stock for $30 a share, he more than doubled his investment in fewer than 2 years. Stockholders filed suit, but nothing came of it. Since Joe was in a position to dictate the terms of the deal, he was able to craft the transaction to enrich himself. Moreover, he took advantage of privileged information from the files of major stockholders in the movie companies who were clients of Guy Currier, his partner at RKO. While Currier was on vacation in Italy, Kennedy pillaged his files for inside information, such as the size of holdings of other stockholders and their financial condition. He then used the information to further his own interests. When Currier returned, he discovered that RKO's value had plummeted, and he and his fellow investors had been betrayed. Joe Kennedy did not behave in an honorable way, said Anne Annabel, Currier's granddaughter. Unfortunately, my grandfather didn't realize how corrupt Kennedy was, she said. In Joe's papers, Doris Keene's Goodwin found letters from anguished stockholders of Pathé. Ann Lawler of Jamaican Plain in Boston said she lost her life savings. This hardly seems Christian-like, fair, or just for a man of your character, she wrote. I wish you would think over the poor working women who had so much faith in you as to give all their money to your Pathé. In 1931, Pantages refused Kennedy's offer of $8 million for his businesses. But after months of operating in the red, Pantages finally relented. Only now Kennedy paid Pantages less than $4 million, much less money than it had cost Pantages to build his Greek theater empire chain. Mentally beaten into submission, Pantages relented and gave away his theater chain to Kennedy for a fraction of what it was worth. Pantages went into reluctant early retirement, and by 1936 he was dead. In the winter of 1931, New York Governor Franklin D. Roosevelt, who was allegedly in the pocket of Kennedy's rum-running partners in New York City, Madden and Costello, enticed Kennedy with a job to basically be his bagman for campaign contributions for his run for the presidency. With Kennedy's connections to the underworld, he was able to funnel illegal cash contributions from the mob into FDR's presidential campaign coffers, reportedly totaling $200,000. As a reward for services rendered, when FDR was elected president, he gave Kennedy the plum position of chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission, which is like putting the fox in charge of the henhouse. With his access to information inside the Roosevelt administration, Kennedy was able to find out in advance that the fix was in for the repeal of Prohibition. Knowing his pals Madden and Costello were already making a smooth transition to other illegal activities, including gambling and prostitution, Kennedy decided to go completely straight. No more illegal shenanigans. Well, almost. In 1931, Pantages ran into more legal troubles in San Diego. Accused of contributing to the delinquency of a minor, he went on trial. Jurors failed to reach a verdict. The case was dismissed. Pantages was accused of being involved in a love market, today's escort service, where he and a small group of businessmen kept a stable of young girls on call for parties. But this never reached a trial, as reported in the New York Times, March 11, 1931. In 1932, 12 million Americans were jobless. Governments responded with strict tariff restrictions that dried up world trade. In Germany, where 5.6 million people were out of work, the Depression contributed to the rise of Adolf Hitler. Considerably richer because of his short selling, Joe Kennedy gleefully told friends that he had sold off his Wall Street holdings before the bottom dropped out of the stock market. He said he was now waiting to pick up the pieces left by dumb people. Joe Kennedy's wealth was now estimated at over $100 million. Variety reported that the Palace had been losing $5,000 a week for over a year, and the Palace's conversion to a movie theater that November is considered the end of the golden age of vaudeville. November 11th, Dixie Martin filed for divorce. In 1933, on January 10th, Mrs. Margaret Martin, Alexander Pantages' adopted daughter, who is known on the stage as Dixie Martin, testified in court that her orchestra-leading husband, Orland Slim Martin, neglected her and would frequently stay away from home until 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, then refused to explain. She was granted a divorce. Upon emerging from jail, Pantages tried to revive his vaudeville empire, but the cards were stacked against him. On the radio, Pantages was listening to Sophie Tucker and other comedians and singers who had honed their skills in front of audiences at his vaudeville theaters. Sophie Tucker said, "Folks weren't so highbrow they cried for Ibsen and Shakespeare the way babies cried for Castoria in the ads. Folks wanted a belly laugh every so often. They wanted to let down their hair and unbutton their vests and be natural. They wanted to laugh at sex. Sex was funny, not necessarily intense and tragic the way the playwrights, such as Ibsen, had made it out to be. Why weren't the best jokes in the world the ones that played on sex? And suppose burlesque was vulgar the way vaudeville said it was. Hell, folks were vulgar. Otherwise burlesque wouldn't be the good business it was, playing to full houses 45 weeks of the year." On the radio, Pantages heard the story about Pringle, telling her lawyer that she wanted to come clean. Stories began circulating that she was about to blow the lid off the rape case and name names. Lois was mentioned in the newspapers off and on over the next several years, mainly in connection with her thoroughbred racehorses and her frequent visits to Santa Anita. After a short-lived marriage to the cowboy Floyd Warner, in 1933, single again, Klondike Kate received a letter from an old admirer from her Dawson days, Johnny Matson, a Swedish Yukon gold miner who split his time between Alaska and Oregon, who had been in love with her for more than 3 decades. A silent young Swedish fellow that would come every night religiously and watch Klondike Kate dance. His neighborhood had brought him a copy of the paper portraying the story of the Pantages trial and Kate's role. Matson had never left the Yukon, nor had he ever stopped loving Kate. In his letter, he proposed, and on July 14, 1933, the couple were married in Vancouver, British Columbia. Johnny went back to his claim in the Yukon, and Kate went back to Bend, Oregon. For the next 13 years, they would spend 2 weeks together a year. The couple lived separately, he near his Yukon gold mine, she in Oregon. They got together only once a year. In between, he wrote her beautiful love letters, and she wrote him poetry. Kate never visited Johnny's cabin in the Yukon. Johnny sent money for the upkeep on her house, and furs and diamonds. Kate kept Johnny happy. Johnny would not have Kate staying with him on his claim during the winter, believing it was too dangerous and too remote should anything happen to her. The couple agreed that Kate would visit him in the summer and then return to the States during the harsh Yukon winters. Although Johnny looked forward to the day he would make his strike and retire with Kate in the States, it was never to come. The couple was happily married until in 1946, Kate suffered yet another loss when Johnny Matson's body was found on a frozen trail 7 miles from his remote cabin in Alaska. Joe Kennedy was again manipulating the stock market to his advantage, even as federal investigators were swarming over Wall Street trying to expose the conditions that had led to the crash. The stock market crash and resulting panic would eventually lead to the creation of the Securities and Exchange Commission, to which Joe was named head. The states had also begun repealing prohibition, and with his usual foresight, Joe could see it was only a matter of time before the 18th Amendment was repealed and liquor flowed freely again. Kennedy used his connections in Washington to obtain permits to import ridiculously large quantities of Hagen and Duress as medicine. He stockpiled the liquor in warehouses so that when Prohibition ended, he would have more high-quality liquor in stock than anybody else. Joe also took steps to make sure he had cornered the market in Scotch. In September, Joe invited the president's son, James Roosevelt, to join him on a trip to England. Joe used young Roosevelt to get access to those who had controlled Scotland's distilleries. Returning with distribution rights to brands such as Hagen, Dewar Scotch, and Gordon's Gin, Joe proceeded to build Somerset importers into a force in the liquor business. On December 5th, Prohibition was repealed and Kennedy was ready. Kennedy grew his fortune with distribution rights for Scotch whiskey. His company, Somerset Importers, became the exclusive American agent for Gordon's Gin and Dewar Scotch. In addition, Kennedy purchased spirits importation rights from Shenley Industries, a firm in Canada. He owned the largest office building in the country, Chicago's Merchandise Mart, which gave his family an important base in that city, an alliance with the Irish-American political leadership there. On December 5, 1933, when Prohibition was repealed by the 21st Amendment, Kennedy, through his new company, Somerset Importers, went from millionaire rum runner to being the largest single distributor of Scotch in the United States of America. And now it was all legal. Riding the coattails of FDR, Kennedy served Roosevelt's administration in many capacities, culminating in 1938 with his appointment as ambassador to the United Kingdom. Kennedy moved his wife and his brood, which now numbered 9 kids, to England. Yet this was the job, despite Kennedy's initial popularity in England, that would eventually end all political aspirations that Joe Kennedy had for himself. Quite simply, Kennedy was a disaster as ambassador to the United Kingdom. Concerning Hitler and Germany's impending threat to the world peace, Kennedy was an appeaser, basically telling the British that Hitler was not such a big problem, and if he was a problem, Hitler was their problem, and no concern of the United States of America. Joe Kennedy's recommendation to FDR was that the United States not involve itself in Europe's difficulties. On February 17, 1935, 2 of the girls who applied for jobs in the College Rhythm Chorus gave their names as Dixie Martin and June Carlin. Nobody paid a great deal of attention to them. Having had previous dancing experience, they were easily able to satisfy Prinz. One day, however, a Los Angeles socialite visited the studio and discovered her 2 friends working in the chorus. Then it was revealed that these girls were Dixie Pantages, adopted daughter of Alexander Pantages, nationally known theatrical magnate, and June Klinder of the university which bears his name. "I am not doing this just for the fun of it," explains Miss Sage. "Our family has gone broke and I need the money. Naturally, I don't want to be a chorus girl all of my life. I am hoping this will lead to something better. It has for a lot of other girls." Pantages ended his retirement on November 21, 1935, when he announced plans for expanding his 2-theater company. The Depression is over, the court tragedy is past, and Alexander Pantages is back in the show business, 100%. "I tried oil, mining, and other investments, but my business is the theater, and it's great to be back," he said. His reputation destroyed, he remained a pariah for a time before he was exonerated, only to fade into irrelevance and finally perhaps premature death. A second, and yet perhaps more compelling reason, is that film exhibitors like Pantages did not get the public acclaim they deserved. Publicity was lavished on the creative talents who made the movies, the actors, directors, even writers, rather than exhibitors and producers. The magazines devoted to film exhibition, existing at the time, focused on movie stars. Largely ignored were tens of thousands of people spread around the country who showcased the films on the nation's screens. But Pantages' dream was not to come true this time. On February 17, 1936, Pantages died quietly in his sleep from heart failure. He was survived by his wife Lois, his 2 sons Rodney and Lloyd, his daughter Carmen, and stepdaughter Dixie. The former multimillionaire's estate was reported to be a mere $5,026. Although he was acquitted after serving only 2 years, Pantages suffered a heart attack and huge financial loss and never fully recovered from either. Pantages died 5 years after his release from prison. He was not a jolly, backslapping personality, and he seems to have had few friends outside of his business associates and family. Despite lacking personal charm, the industry that he helped to build stood behind him. Perhaps this support provided him some solace when the theatrical empire he built so doggedly and led so effectively was divided and ignominiously sold off. The normal tributes followed, but the industry was a different one than what he had known in the early part of the century. The attacks against the supposed Jewish domination of Hollywood of previous decades had subsided. The culture wars that pitted traditionalist against modernist, in which Jews were seen trying to de-Christianize America, had waned. The industry imposed self-censorship and moral clauses in actors' contracts. Industry scandals that had so titillated the 1920s had been brought under control. Pantages was interred in the great mausoleum Sanctuary of Benediction at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, California. Among Hollywood notables attending his funeral were the Skouras brothers, who would succeed him on the Greek throne of Hollywood. By the time of his death, worth only a fraction of his original net worth, his influence had dwindled, and his active involvement in the theater had largely come to an end. The stamp of Alexander Pantages' influence on theater in Seattle survived his death, as did the presence of his theater on the landscape of the city. His body was discovered by John Gorkin, the gardener, dispatched to his room when he failed to come downstairs for breakfast. Startled by the gardener's cries, Mrs. Lois Pantages and her son Lloyd rushed into the room to find the one-time vaudeville king dead. Another son, Rodney Pantages, and daughter Carmen, the wife of John C. Considine Jr., movie producer, reached the palatial Vermont Avenue home a few minutes later. Dr. Leland Chairman, who had been treating Pantages for heart disease, said Pantages had been ill for several months. The illness had hampered Pantages' plans to re-enter the theatrical field he deserted some 7 years ago, when he figured in the sensational trial. On February 17, 1937, charging that her former husband is $6,700 behind in payments to her following a divorce settlement, Dixie Martin, foster daughter of the late Alexander Pantages, was to appear in court to press her suit against Orland Slim Martin, orchestra leader. She said Martin earned as much as $350 a week. As World War II edged closer to the American consciousness, Carol Lombard, the New Deal Democrat and fan of FDR, began to drape herself in the flag. There was nothing unusual about this action, because movie stars routinely told the public what the public wanted to hear. But Lombard put her money where her mouth was, literally. When it was revealed that in 1937, she paid all but $20,000 of her $500,000 salary in taxes, she said, "Taxes go to build schools, to maintain the public utilities we all use, so why not? I live accordingly, that's all." Carol continued to use Dixie Pantages as a stand-in. They continued to be best friends. On March 15th, Dixie Martin, 27, eloped to Yuma and became the bride of Philip Karlstein, 28, assistant director at Universal Studios. In 1939, there was some sort of cosmic justice involved when Carol Lombard, who had once professed that Hollywood marriages can't succeed, fell in love with the fan-voted king of Hollywood, Clark Gable. Carol read and loved the book Gone with the Wind. Excited, she sent a copy of the book to Clark Gable, with a note attached reading, "Let's do it." Gable wrongly assumed she was making a sexual advance to him and called Carol to organize a date. When he found out Carol wanted to make a film of the book with him as Rhett Butler and her as Scarlett, he refused, and kept the copy of the book she had given him thereafter in his bathroom. They became Hollywood's most beautiful and unconventional couple. Unconventional because he was still very much married to another woman for the first 2 years of the relationship. When Gable finally untangled himself, he and Lombard eloped in the spring of 1939 during production of Gone with the Wind, and settled into life on a ranch in the San Fernando Valley dubbed the House of Two Gables. They were the Brangelina of their day, certainly in popularity, but Gable loathed the press and kept as low a profile as a king could keep. Lombard never met a camera she didn't like, or as close friend Alice Marble put it, "What a ham, what a ham." The marriage of self-involved Gable and socially conscious, shutter-loving Lombard worked for a while. Carol Lombard had a little dachshund named Commissioner that ignored Clark Gable completely. After her death in 1942, the dog would not leave Gable's side. At the divorce trial, George Kilma, private detective, testified he had led a safari composed of himself, Joseph Martin, and the young Pantages to Mrs. Pantages' bedroom in their Nottingham mansion. The bedroom door was locked and they crashed through, finding Lois in bed with bartender Pete Bedwell. As he scrambled to put on his pants, Pantages took a sock at him. Pantages' anger then turned on his wife. He ran over and pulled off the bed sheets. She didn't have any clothes on. What he said was both forgettable and loud. Beatrice and Rodney divorced in 1939 after an acrimonious public trial. Newspapers across the country carried details of the scandalous testimony. He accused her of habitual intemperance and association with other men. She accused him of indiscreet conduct on a yacht, as reported in the Los Angeles Times on October 12, 1939. Originally, she got control over their 3 children and $605 per month. Then the Quaker housekeeper would not testify under oath. When the divorce was finally granted, Beatrice lost custody of her children and was awarded only $100 a month. The country was shocked by the contents of a letter Beatrice wrote to her Palm Springs bartender lover that was eventually read in court and reprinted in newspapers. She filed countersuit claiming he beat her. In his final statement, the judge wrote, "Mrs. Pantages is to have the right of visiting the children at all reasonable times when she is not under the influence of intoxicants," as reported in the Milwaukee Sentinel, December 2, 1939. John W. Considine, Jr. received the American Institute of Cinematography, Inc.'s Award of Achievement and honorary membership for the year 1939, in recognition of his distinguished achievement as producer of many notable pictures, including Boys Town. In 1940, Joe Kennedy's term as ambassador and his political ambitions ended abruptly during the Battle of Britain in November 1940, with the publishing of his controversial remarks suggesting that democracy is finished in England, it may be here in the US. Kennedy resigned under pressure shortly afterward. Rodney Pantages entered the wired jukebox market with Maestro Your Choice by Voice system in autumn. He later made cabinets for the system, offering a program of not less than 2,000 music selections. The influence of the theater business can be seen in the design of the Maestro Music Speaker Selector. Looks like a large wall sconce seen in Art Deco movie theaters. This innovative music selection speaker device was connected to a remote location that transmitted over telephone lines. Depositing 10 cents for one song or 25 cents for 3 would connect you to the operator by microphone for your song selection. Selection would then be played on a turntable and transmitted to the speaker by telephone line. It was part of a system that consisted of counter boxes for table or on bar and a large mirrored unit. Song titles were listed on sheets handed out to patrons at bar and tables. Melody Lane Restaurant, Hollywood, California, was Pantages' most famous installation of the micro music system, the unique concept for the 1940s wireless music. This stately Art Deco piece of coin-op history measured 31 inches high by 14 inches wide by 9 inches deep. In 1941, by the time the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, cracks were showing in the marital veneer of Gable and Lombard, in part because of Gable's alley cat prowling. The newly formed Hollywood Victory Committee went searching for a star to host the first event to raise funds for national defense against Japan and Germany. Lombard leapt out of her seat to volunteer, and plans quickly developed for a wintertime trip to Indianapolis, where she would sell war bonds in the Capitol building of her home state. 3 days by train, with whistle stops preceded arrival in Chicago and a day of appearances there. Then a commute to Indianapolis for 12 hours, where she faced the crush to deliver 2 heartfelt speeches broadcast on national radio, and participate in 2 flag raising, a tea, a dinner, and 2 receptions, all of which helped to raise $2 million for the war effort in one long day, 4 times the amount projected. At the end of that, on January 15th, she decided she had done her duty, and now it was time to take care of herself by getting home to her carousing husband by the fastest means possible. That meant air travel, something expressly forbidden because of the fear of accidents in wintry weather or sabotage by Hitler's spies. To which the response was predictable: kiss my ass. At 7:20 local time on January 16, the brightest flame in Hollywood suddenly grew into the brightest flame on Mount Potosi, Nevada, when TWA Flight 3 failed to clear the 9,000-foot peak and hit near vertical cliffs. It took the better part of 24 hours to sort it all out and come to grips with the fact that Force of Nature Lombard now ranked as the highest profile casualty in the New World War. She rose to glory at age 33, leaving behind a legend as Hollywood's most original movie star, along with a legacy of charity to her fellow humans and service to a nation just beginning to understand what sacrifices lay ahead. Kennedy authorized surgeons to perform a lobotomy on his daughter Rosemary. The procedure left her permanently incapacitated. Kennedy worked behind the scenes to continue building the financial and political fortunes of the Kennedy family. After a disabling stroke during his son's presidency in 1961, Kennedy developed aphasia and lost all power of speech, but remained mentally intact. He was confined to a wheelchair until his death in 1969. Wisconsin Congressman John Schaefer took to the floor of the House to denounce Joe Kennedy as the chief racketeer in the RKO swindle. Another congressman, William Sirovich of New York, said, "The inside group at RKO had committed fraud by unloading their stock, making millions." He called for an investigation of the movie industry, but by then Joe had become close to key congressional leaders as well as to President Roosevelt, and the probe was mysteriously halted. On July 18th at approximately 5:30 p.m., after a day of bowling on Catalina Island, Lois Pantages went for a swim off her yacht, La Pan, anchored in Avalon Bay. She was climbing back aboard the ship when she suffered a fatal heart attack. In 1943, Klondike Kate was invited back to Los Angeles for the filming of Klondike Kate, starring Ann Savage. Kate would later say it was entirely fictional, and I don't recognize anything in it that happened to me. She captivated the brown derby in Hollywood by hiking her skirt above the knee and extricating tobacco and cigarette papers from her garter. She rolled herself a smoke with one hand, then taught the trick to the film's starlets. Kate played to an audience wherever she found one. Angelinos were curious about the woman newspapers called a shady lady, the former mistress of one of Hollywood's richest men. Society people invited her into their homes, where she enlivened parties with tall tales and sometimes off-color jokes. But after a few moments of hobnobbing with the likes of Marlene Dietrich and Cary Grant, she returned to the Pacific Northwest, where Oregonians welcomed her back. Kate had some minor success training Hollywood starlets in the 40s. In November 1946, Kennedy, with eggs smeared all over his face, resigned as ambassador to the United Kingdom. Joe Kennedy was ruined in politics and he knew it. So Joe Kennedy decided to do the next best thing, propel one of his sons to the presidency of the United States of America. Papa Kennedy's first choice was his son Joe Jr., but on August 12, 1944, naval aviator Joseph Kennedy Jr. was killed when his plane vaporized during a flight mission over southeast England. Plan B for Papa Kennedy was his second oldest son, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, JFK, who had already been declared a war hero in August of 1943, when he escaped death and helped save the lives of his men, when the torpedo boat he commanded, PT-109, was sunk by a Japanese destroyer. When the war ended, Papa Kennedy went right to work on establishing John's career. His first move was to get his son elected to congressman of the 8th District in Massachusetts. The only problem was the present congressman, Democrat James Michael Curley, the former 3-time mayor of Boston, had every intention of running for Congress again. But money talks, and Joe Kennedy had plenty of dough. Papa Joe knew Curley has cash flow problems, so he convinced Curley that he should step down as congressman and run for mayor of Boston again. Curley protested, saying he needed money to properly run a mayoral campaign. Papa Joe said, "No problem," and he gave Curley a reported $100,000 to run for mayor, and he even paid the salary of Curley's campaign manager. The end result was Curley was elected mayor of Boston for the 4th time, and in 1946, John F. Kennedy was elected to Congress. JFK served in Congress for 8 years. In the spring of 1946, having no letters for a year, Klondike Kate traveled to the Yukon in search of her husband. Kate hired a guide to mush through woods. He found Johnny Matson and guided the Mounties back. Johnny had died of natural causes, then torn apart by wolves. Kate had a headstone put up in the wilderness for him. "I guess I'll just mush on and smile," she said. On March 21, 1947, Rodney Pantages was questioned and released after his car was involved in the fatal head-on collision of Guy Winslet, 60, in Hollywood. Pantages told Officer Owen H. Tucker that he was in his office at the time of the accident at the intersection of Las Feliz Boulevard and Cheswick, shortly before 3 p.m. He said J.S. Snodgrass, 42, an associate, or Held McHugh, 49, his auditor, may have borrowed his car. Both denied it. The parking lot attendant told police that at 4 p.m., Pantages came for his car, but it was not in the lot. John Fickling, 25, a witness, was not able to identify any of the 3 men. In 1948, not long after her husband's death, Klondike Kate heard from another former admirer. His name was W.L. Bill Van Duren, a longtime resident of Bend, Oregon, frequent boarder in her house, and an accountant whom Kate had nursed back to health in 1930 at her Oregon convalescent home. "I was the flower of the North, but the petals are falling fast, honey," she said. 2 years later, in 1948, Kate, then 72, went to the altar again. They were married in Vancouver, Washington. Van Duren's eyesight had failed the year before, and Kate raised money to pay for surgery. When she came up short, she petitioned the county to cover the rest, promising that he'd work it off when his eyesight returned. The county did, and Van Duren kept his end of the bargain. Klondike Kate Rockwell Mourner Matson Van Duren died peacefully in Oregon in 1957, but her legend and her stories are still very much alive. In Dawson, she was the queen of the Yukon, the beautiful and seductive entertainer of the gold rush. Yet to the people of Central Oregon, where she lived out her elderly years on her quiet farm, she was simply Aunt Kate. But it was her enthusiasm for adventure and her ability to live life without regrets that made her stand out. At the end of Kate's life, she recounted her many adventures for her published memoir. "Any regrets?" her biographer asked. She thought for a while, wrote, then shook her head no. "I wouldn't have known what I know now if I hadn't lived the way I have." They retired to Sweet Home, Oregon. In 1949, Howard Hughes and RKO bought the Pantages Theater from Fox, with Hughes setting up an office for himself on the second floor, to scope out the dames at Hollywood and Vine, no doubt. Over the next 11 years, the RKO Pantages, you can still see RKO written clearly in the theater's foyer, hosted the Academy Awards half a dozen times. In 1952, Carmen Pantages divorced John Considine Jr. In 1954, Klondike Kate appeared on TV in the Groucho Marx show You Bet Your Life. She died 3 years later in her sleep at age 80. In 1957, on February 21st, Klondike Kate died peacefully in her sleep at her home in Sweet Home, Oregon. She died in obscurity, but with a wish to scatter her ashes. Sadly, her husband was too ill to fulfill Kate's last wish. He got sick and moved away to live with his son. Kate's ashes remained at a mortuary in Salem until 1960, when a stranger signed out her ashes and fulfilled her wish. In 1965, in Seattle, Pantages' second theater, built in 1915, fell, as many of its sister houses already had, to the wrecking ball, having by then outlived the age of vaudeville by 30 years. Joe Kennedy's son Robert was assassinated on June 5, 1968. In the aftermath of his son's death, Kennedy made his last public appearance when he, his wife, and son Ted made a filmed message to the country. He died at home in Hyannisport the following year on November 18, 1969. He was 81 years old. Joe took steps to protect his fortune and the future of his children. He moved to establish a series of trust funds that would eventually make all his children financially independent. These trust funds would eventually guarantee each of his children and their mother over $20 million apiece. Due to the unfortunate circumstances, he had outlived 3 of his 4 sons and 1 of his 5 daughters. He was buried at Hollywood Cemetery in Brookline, Massachusetts. Kennedy's widow, Rose, was buried next to him following her death in 1995, as was their daughter Rosemary in 2005. In 1989, on her deathbed, 60 years after the fact, Eunice Pringle confessed to her mother and a friend that Joe Kennedy had paid her to set up Pantages. Knowing that framing an innocent man would ruin Pantages and force him to sell his theaters to Kennedy. In exchange for their perjured testimony, Kennedy had paid $10,000 to Pringle's agent and lover, Nicholas Dunaev. Joe had also promised he would make Pringle a star. Pringle, however, never became a star, and Dunaev never gave her any money. Pringle admitted in the retrial she had been pursuing Pantages to book her dance number since May 1929. Pantages could easily have seduced her then, and why would one rape a dance girl that he had refused employment 3 times? It is almost certain that Pringle was after money. for the fatal meeting with him came only days after Pantages was reported flushed with millions from the sale of his theaters. Even after his conviction and first heart attack, Pringle would still attack him with a $1 million damage lawsuit. Despite the verdict against him, Pantages was successful in fending off a civil suit brought against him by Pringle.